Shalom! Shalom, thank you so much for joining us again for another video, another class, on our Kodago Able channel, where we constantly, with God's help, continue to advance in our free course on the Mishna, that ancient interpretation that gives spirit and practice to the Bible. I also remind you, before starting today's class, that you should please subscribe if you haven't already, as well as give us a like and share this video on WhatsApp, Facebook, SMS, or whatever means you prefer, and thus help us grow this channel and our community. I also remind you that I am Abel Flores, a journalist passionate about the study of Kabbalah, metaphysics, and the Bible for over 20 years. In this course, I simply hope that you will fall in love with studying the Torah, the Bible, and all extra-biblical literature that will help you strengthen your faith and improve your life and that of your loved ones. On the other hand, and as I have said on several occasions, I am not a spiritual or religious leader, nor do I represent any doctrine, community, or religion. I am only a communicator and researcher who seeks to inform people about how to understand the Bible in its origin and context, so that this may serve their personal growth and defend our Judeo-Christian civilization, which has marked the course of humanity for the last 2 millennia with a message of love, justice, and universal peace. If we do not defend these principles of faith and freedom, equality and love, we will lose everything. Just a quick glance at the world news shows how badly we are doing as a civilization and humanity.
Remember that the Bible is not read, but studied. Open like when a doctor or scientist studies a body or object to understand it better, to explore it and understand its mechanisms, its functions, its secrets, and thus generate higher knowledge. Likewise, the Bible, the Torah specifically, is a message that contains a code that comes from infinity, and it, the Word, contains a message for every being that has passed through the cosmos.
Without further ado, let's begin with a class that will make your hair stand on end. You'll see.
Now, let's begin reading today's Mishnah teaching. Mishnah Berakhot 3:2 states, after burying the deceased and returning, if they have enough time to begin reciting the Shema and finish it before reaching the line formed by the mourners, through which the mourners will pass to receive consolation, they should begin reciting it. But if they do not have enough time to complete the entire recitation of the Shema, they should not begin. Those in the inner line, in front of which the
mourners and those who console them pass, are exempt from reciting the Shema. But those in the outer line, who only show their respect without direct contact with the mourners, are obligated to recite the Shema. Okay, now we'll begin an in-depth study of this Mishnah located in Berakhot 3:2. The Mishnah says, my own translation, after burying the deceased and returning, if they can begin and finish before reaching the Shura, comfort line, let them begin, and if not, let them not begin. Those standing in the line, those inside, are exempt. Those outside are obligated. Ramban Maimonides explains the scenario. Upon leaving the burial, the mourners line up to receive consolation. If the attendants manage to begin and complete even one verse before reaching the line, they begin. If not, they console first and then recite. Those in the inner line, who see the mourners' faces, are exempt from the Shema. Those in the outer line are obligated. Here we are faced with the underlying halakhic logic that we have studied in previous Mishnayot or classes. OSCK be-mitzva patur min ha-mitzvah, one who is engaged in one mitzvah is exempt from another. Here, those in the inner row are fully engaged in the mitzvah of nihum aveilim, comforting the mourner, hence their exemption. Those in the outer row are merely showing respect because they are not immediate family members and are not directly engaged, hence their continued obligation in Shema. Also, remember what we learned in the previous class, the status of the onin and the avel. Before the burial, the bereaved, onin, is exempt from the Shema, the Amidah, among other temporal commandments. As stated in Berakhot 3.1 and its Gemara 17b, after the burial, aninat ceases and mourning, avelat, begins. Mishnah 3:2 specifically addresses the post-burial period on the way to the Shura, that is, when the week of mourning begins in the deceased's home. This Mishnah teaches not to begin the reading of the Shema if there will be an interruption, because the laws of Shema permit greetings only in limited or special circumstances, interruptions between paragraphs, as we learned in Berakhot 2:1. If it is anticipated that the deceased's relatives will arrive at the Shura and might be interrupted, then one does not begin. But why is there such a rush to recite the Shema? Because in the context of the death of a close relative until their burial, it is understood that close relatives have not recited the Shema. So it could be that they have been reciting it for several hours, perhaps days, although it is not customary in Judaism for it to be many days. However, there are special cases, and then the mourners have not fulfilled their duty, because they have, of course, been exempt from the most important commandment. So after the burial, it is urgent that they recite the Shema because, as we have already studied, it is the most important commandment in the entire Torah, to accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. It is like an emergency call to heavenly 911, without interference, to help, save, or give light to the soul of every person. The Shema is so important that after the burial, when the important mitzvah or commandment of burying the deceased has been fulfilled, reciting the Shema is as urgent as possible, as long as there are no interruptions or a kavana, or a misguided intention of the heart. You should also learn the Hebrew expression, loigi larash, which means that within 4 cubits, which is about 2 meters today, from a corpse or in the cemetery itself, one does not recite the Shema nor wear tefillin, so as not to mock the defenseless. This explains why one should distance oneself from the corpse after burial before reading the Shema, and why the focus of the journey after burial should be on the merits of the deceased, to help them in the spiritual world. Now, what exactly is the shura, or consolation line? In the context of this Mishnah, it refers to burials and wakes during the Mishnah's time, in the 1st and 2nd century CE. The shura is the double line formed by attendants, so that mourners can receive ritualized consolation. Codified sources describe forming 2 lines and consoling after the Kaddish, with variations, a minimum of 5 per line as opposed to no fewer than 10 in total, depending on custom and poskim. The 16th century Shulchan Arachir Daya 376:4 already alludes to immediate post-burial practices, such as removing leather shoes, moving slightly away from the cemetery out of respect for the deceased, reciting the Kaddish, which is one of the most powerful prayers in Judaism, which we will study in detail later, and then consolation. But why is the timing of the Shema relevant here? The Shema must be said with kavana, at least in its first verse, otherwise it is not fulfilled. Starting when an imminent interruption is foreseen compromises that kavana. Hence the rule, if they manage to begin and finish, according to Rambam Maimonides, complete at least the first verse. Note on modern practice, many contemporary poskim recommend not interrupting the Shema unless absolutely necessary. The social expectation of the grading for honor has changed, which reinforces the advice not to start if one must immediately end. But to better understand this Mishnah, we need to answer this question, which will help us understand the context of what is really happening here. What was a Jewish burial like in the 2nd century? Basically, the goal was to ensure simplicity of burial, and burying the body as soon as possible and avoiding unnecessary delays is a halakhic norm. This prohibition against delaying burial is known as halanat hamet. After the end of the Second Temple in 70 AD, and from 70 to 135 AD, the pattern of excavated tombs with kokim niches is documented in Judea and in Jerusalem and its surrounding areas. The practice of ossulegium, the annual collection of bones in ossuaries. There is extensive archaeological evidence of this, and scholarly syntheses confirm it with multiple archaeological finds in Israel today. The excessively expensive funeral procession for families was limited by an emblematic decree. Rabban Gamliel, our president of the Sanhedrin during this entire period we are discussing in the Mishnah, between the 1st and 2nd centuries, requested burial in plain linen, so as not to burden families financially. From then on, simple takrakim, white shrouds, became standard. But in years prior to this rabbinic decree of Rabban Gamliel, another custom, exactly the opposite, was observed, embalming the deceased with very expensive aromatic spices. Do you remember those verses from the Gospels about how Yeshua was embalmed? This is the reason. Yeshua dies as a martyr when the temple was standing. The decree of Rabban Gamliel had not been issued, and in the time of Yeshua and his apostles, with the temple standing, the economy of Israel, of Judea, although dominated by the Romans, was not as degrading or problematic as when the temple was destroyed, which was not only the religious center, but also the political, commercial, economic center of the Jewish people for 5 centuries, from the biblical time of Ezra and Nehemiah until its destruction in the year 70. Let me put it another way. In the time of Hillel, Shammai, even Jesus and Yeshua and their emissaries, this generation could be known as the first generation of Tanaim. There was poverty, but not hunger. However, after the destruction of the temple, a period of scarcity, famine, and even malnutrition began in the Jewish communities in Israel, lasting until the Bar Kokhba revolt between 132 and 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt, Rome's second war against the Jews. These years were apocalyptic, literally. In fact, a historical study of the Book of Revelation, believed to have been written in the late 1st century, shows that many of its revelations point to those years. From the end of the 1st century until the near annihilation of the Jewish people in Israel in 135, with Bar Kokhba and Akiva. I'm not saying that the entire apocalypse points to these years, but some of it speaks to these years. How do you know this? Well, apply what we're teaching about the rules of scriptural interpretation, such as Hillel's 7 rules of interpretation, Rabbi Ishmael's 13 rules of interpretation, and Eliezer the Galilean's 32 rules. With these minute of interpretation, you can better understand each book of the Bible. Why? Because whoever wrote them edited their teachings with these rules. It's a code that you now know and must put into practice if you want to know the truth, because you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I'm telling you all this because these years, from 70 to 135, were a time of genocide against the Jews, equal to or worse than the Nazi Holocaust, of persecution, of the slaughter of children and women simply for being Jewish. For keeping Shabbat, where belief in God, in one God as the God of Israel, the same God preached by Yeshua, the same God preached by Paul or Saul of Tarsus to the Gentiles, was a reason for annihilation by Roman imperial decree. This is historical. There are Roman sources that corroborate this, because God was the Roman emperor. So, as I already told you, if things were already difficult for the generations who lived with the Temple of Jerusalem standing before the year 70, but due to the very corruption of the temple and Roman rule with the payment of tribute to Caesar, there was poverty, all this became exponentially worse after the destruction of the temple. That is why the rabbinical decree of Rabban Gamliel to make burials humble, without high costs or embalming. Because as we have already studied Rabban Gamliel, who is a specialist in understanding the limits of rabbinical decrees or regulations, and the commandments of the Torah did not want to impose a very expensive burden on burials when it was a people who suffered from hunger and persecution as had not happened in many centuries, perhaps since the time of the Maccabees against the Greeks, too. Centuries before the Common Era. Now, so that we always understand the evolution of societies and the differences between Tannaitic Judaism, from the time of the Mishnah in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and the current, postmodern, normative Judaism of the 21st century. Burials according to modern Judaism are as follows. In Israel, bodies are often buried without a coffin, burial in takrakim directly in the ground, a practice supervised by the Hefsek, which is a group of Orthodox rabbis specializing in all the laws of mourning and burial. Every Jewish community today, and for centuries, has a department of the Hefsek, which means sacred society in Hebrew. In the diaspora, by regulations of each country, burials in Judaism are carried out in compliance with the laws of each country where Jews live and of which they are a part. According to Judaism, every Jewish community must respect the laws of the countries where they lived. Life. But in Israel, burials without coffins are permitted, which is the biblical custom. By the way, regarding the Chaper Kadisha, they are the same ones you see in photographs or on television when, unfortunately, there is a deadly attack or accident in Israel. Bearded men wearing yarmulkes arrive to religiously clean and tidy the entire scene of the accident or attack to give all possible honor to the deceased, their bodies, and their families. After authorization from the homicide detectives and the forensic department, the Hevra Kadisha arrives to collect all the mementos, belongings, even body parts. Even when there are mutilations, they have the difficult task of collecting everything, even collecting the blood with sponges. By the end of this class, you will better understand why they do all this. In the diaspora, when a coffin is used, Jewish law, or halacha, requires a simple wooden one, aaron, without metal, and without embalming unless required. Legal, depending on each country as already explained. The takrijim is like a simple white burial garment, codified today by rabbinic leaders and funeral associations. Its historical rationale dates back to Rabban Gamliel. It's like a tunic. If you want a famous example, it's like the Turin mantle or the holy shroud with which Jesus' body was supposedly covered at his burial. We're not talking about whether it's real or not here. What we're explaining with this example is that these are the ontos with which Jews are buried to this day, and this is a custom that dates back to the time of the Second Temple. In burials today, according to the Torah, the principle of celerity is maintained within the modern legal and logistical limits of each country. Shiva, which is the 7 days of mourning, or Avalat, Shlashim, which is the month or 30 days, and other phases of mourning remain in effect from the time of the Mishna to this day. The Shura, or the line. Many communities maintain the double line at the end of the burial. Current community manuals expressly indicate this. On the other hand, we must explain these expressions that appear in our Mishna today. Inner versus outer is not abstract geography. Inner is the one who sees the mourner's face because of how close they are to the body, they are interacting with it, and outer are the peripheral companions. This is what transforms respect into an active mitzvah. Regarding the number of people in the line, some sources speak of 2 lines with at least 5 per row, if possible, and others speak of a total of no fewer than 10. These are different minhagim customs regarding the same concept. Regarding this first part of the lesson, we must conclude that Mishnah Berakhot 3.2 is not a technicality. It is a map of sacred priorities. When prayer and compassion collide, active compassion, comforting the mourner, takes center stage. The Shema is not lowered, its integrity, kavana, time, and dignity is preserved by placing it where it does not compete with the mitzvah of mourning. That tension and its resolution remain fully relevant. And for those who have seen Hillel's class on the 7 rules of interpretation, it is clearly seen here how the Kalvat Shomer, or principle of greater weight, is applied to understanding and legislating in the Torah. Why is the burial of the corpse prioritized over close relatives reciting the Shema until after the burial? Because the burial of a family member is only once or only a few times in a lifetime, so fulfilling this commandment is a priority, an opportunity to honor your family that you will have only a few times in your life. It is very important or chomer heavy. But reciting the Shema every day, twice at night and in the morning, you can do it every day for the rest of your life. Now, we come to the part of the class that many have been waiting for, because it is the mystical, spiritual, Kabbalistic, and even metaphysical aspect of what is being discussed here. So, we will try to answer a question based on biblical and extra-biblical sources. What happens to the soul at death? At the moment of death, the Bible sets the general framework. Dust returns to the earth, and the spirit returns to God who gave it Kohelet/Ecclesiastes 12:7. The sages of the Talmud discuss this verse and explain that, when the body returns to dust, the ruach/neshama returns to its source. It is the point of separation of soul and body. In parallel, tradition describes the soul as being aware of its immediate surroundings. Berakhot 18b discusses what the dead know and concludes, contrary to a literal reading of the dead know nothing, that the deceased do perceive what is happening among the living to some degree. But to understand this, we need to explain that the soul is divided into several parts, but the body is not. The body is one. This is the same as when we studied the worlds, the four worlds or universes, where we said that Asya is the earth or matter, a single space, but the heavens are plural because they are many, Yetzirah, Bria, and Atzilut. This follows the same rule. The spiritual worlds are larger, more powerful, even unimaginable, but the material world is one and unique. Thus, with man, the body is one and unique, but the soul has divisions. Kabbalah speaks of basic levels of the soul, nefesh, ruach, neshama, with distinct functions. The nefesh is the living or animal soul. It is every living being. In terms of biology, it is everything that has life, whether plant or animal. Their bodies, so in this case, animals and humans share a particularity. They have nefesh. Their instincts, genetics, matter. It is the stardust from which man, Adam, was created. The ruach is the spirit. There is speech, emotions, ideas, thought. There is a discussion here that we won't go into in depth now, but some Kabbalists believe that some animals have ruach, but this is a topic for the Gilgulim. Let's not go into that today, but it is important for me that you know the reality of what all of Judaism teaches, because I don't want to deny or hide anything from you. And there is the third level, which is the spirit or neshama, which is the soul that God breathed into man. The neshama is the soul. It is the part of God that is within the human being. Therein lies ethics, morals, and intellect. It is the part of man that returns to the Father, while the body returns to dust. But what about the spirit? After death, a phase dynamic emerges. A dimension of nefesh remains linked to the location of the body until it is buried, and the spirit and the neshama ascend according to their merit, that is, according to the spiritual growth of the deceased. This scheme is developed in the school of the Ari, in his book Shar HaGilgulim, and other explanations. But between death and burial, the shemira and closeness of the soul occurs. From death until burial, the body is not left alone, shemira, and this is a practice attested by halakhic sources, hence the famous shomer, or guardian of the body, which we mentioned throughout the Jewish burial routine, especially in the previous class. This is done out of respect for the deceased and to avoid dishonoring them, but it is also because the spirit is watching everything. That is, according to Judaism and Kabbalah, when the body dies, the spirit immediately leaves the body. It cannot return, and then it begins to become aware of physical death. For souls who are unfamiliar with the Torah and the workings of the spiritual worlds, this is a tragedy and suffering because the spirit begins to become aware that the spiritual worlds exist, while perhaps in life you did not believe this, or were an atheist. And then the spirit begins to suffer and try to enter the body to repent and fulfill the commandments, but is unable to do so. In fact, the ruach or spirit cannot move 4 cubits from the corpse. Hence the rule of 4 cubits. No spirit or ruach can move more than 2 meters from its location. Classic midrashic texts, such as Bereshit Rabbah 100:7, indicate that for 3 days the soul hovers around the body, hoping to return. Upon perceiving the bodily change, it departs. This is a theological image to describe the phase of separation. The soul that has not studied Torah or Kabbalah is merely the 4th level of interpretation of the same Torah, suffers, because it does not know these things that you are learning today. Therefore, in those moments before burial, rabbinic sensibilities impose modesty around the body, the idea of not mocking the defenseless with religious acts before it and avoiding frivolous acts is present. And as we said, the sages argue that the deceased is aware of what is said in their presence. That's why the Chevra Kadisha is so careful with the body, because the spirit of the deceased, which is your mind, your conscience, is watching everything. It can't leave, nor can it re-enter. And if the death was traumatic, like in a terrorist attack or accident, it's even worse because 1 second you were alive and the next you are already dead. That's why the Chevra Kadisha does everything so carefully, preserving the honor of the body and soul, and reciting psalms to bring light to the scene of the incident. All this suffering of the spirit, or the spirit, ends when the burial is completed. When the burial is complete, the spirit follows the neshama because angels come to seek the spirit. But this basically happens to the person who didn't study Torah, Kabbalah, or keep the commandments. In the case of the righteous person, who is not basically a perfect being, but rather someone who did more good than bad in his life, who studied Torah and delved deeply into study and Kabbalah, in this case, his primary soul is not the ruach, not carnal emotions or memories, but rather his primary soul is the neshama. That is, according to this knowledge, the rasha, the bad person, or someone who did more evil than good in his life, only has a ruach when he dies, because his neshama didn't eat, didn't grow, wasn't nourished, was hidden, tiny. But he who studied Torah, kept the commandments, studied Kabbalah, or at least tried to, and did more good than harm in his life, when he dies, his consciousness is not in his ruach. His consciousness is already a super consciousness, that is. His mind is in his neshama, and since he knows the spiritual world, he had faith, then in that case everything is different, because there he does not become distressed. Rather he understands that his mission was fulfilled and his soul, or neshama, wants to return to its creator. It is said that in this case, when the consciousness is already a super consciousness, that is, your spiritual level reached neshama because you nourished it with teachings from the Mishna, which is the oral Torah, for man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. This is the Mishnah, the oral Torah, the oral tradition that gives life to the soul. Remember the teaching that the neshama soul has the same Hebrew letters as the Mishnah or teaching. In this case, the neshama begins to see light, its ancestors who begin to contact it, and it begins to want to return to Hashem, because the neshama was the soul that God breathed into being at the beginning. So, whether because the spirit is suffering or because the neshama wants to return to its creator as quickly as possible, the burial must be swift, and the body must be respected because the soul of the deceased is there, seeing and hearing everything. By the way, in the Talmudic quote above, which states whether the souls of the dead hear or not, the conclusion is that those who did not keep the Torah, who only have ruach, cannot hear anything because their spiritual level is very low. However, the righteous, tzaddik, who studied and kept the Torah, even has the level to help their relatives, intercede for them because they have merit in this life and the next. But after the burial, the week of mourning or Shiva, what happens? Zoharic mysticism describes 7 days in which the soul goes back and forth between home and grave, weeping for the body and sympathizing with the mourners. This is when the level is only ruach. It is the spiritual matrix of the Shiva. The community accompanies, and the soul visits and finds comfort in them because that spirit or ruach doesn't want to leave. It is attached to matter, just as it didn't seek the spiritual when it was alive. Hence, 2 central practices in the house of mourning. The candle that burns 7 days, Neshama, the lamp of God, is the soul of man, Proverbs 20 verse 27. It is lit in honor of the deceased and, according to Hasidic and halakhic sources, to calm the soul that returns home during those 7 days. This candle is lit so that the ruach in its despair may seek the light. After the Shiva comes the month of mourning, Shaloshin, and, in the exclusive case of deceased parents, the 11-month cycle of Kaddish, the usual custom, plus the annual remembrances, Yartzeit. Why 11 and not 12? Because the Talmud speaks of a 12-month judgment for the wicked. Out of modesty for the memory of our ancestors, the Kaddish is said to last 11 months merely as an act of faith that they were righteous. Now, what is the soul's relationship with its close relatives, and why are the mirrors in the deceased's home covered? This is because of the soul's awareness of what is happening. As we saw, Berakhot 18b admits that the deceased know, to some extent, what is happening among the living. Presence during Shiva. The Zohar describes the souls coming and going between home and grave for 7 days. Therefore, the community is welcomed, prayer is said, and the candle is lit, which comforts the soul and the mourners. What can the living do for the soul? Kaddish, usually recited in the synagogue for 11 months, and tzedakah, or almsgiving in its merit, are the classic channels of elevation, along with Torah study in the name of the deceased. This appears in both rabbinic literature and current halakhic guides. Limit. The Torah prohibits all forms of necromancy, Deresh El Hamadim. Visiting graves to pray to God, not the dead, is a practice that is permitted with caution, but any direct invocation of the deceased is prohibited as idolatry. But why are mirrors covered in the Shiva house? There is no single official reason. It is a widespread minhag custom, not codified in the Talmud, but codified in Kabbalah. Its reasons are grouped into 3 dimensions: ethical, psychological / halakhic. The focus is not on one's own image in mourning. Personal grooming and self-reference are avoided. Covering mirrors helps focus on the loss, not on one's appearance. Furthermore, since prayers are held at home, the destruction of praying in front of mirrors and portraits is avoided. Shiva manuals present this as a consolidated tradition, although its origin is uncertain. There is also a Kabbalistic origin. To mitigate negative influences, popular texts that follow the Kabbalists speak of forces or spirits or reshit that haunt where there is emptiness. The mirror would be a symbolic window to that perception, so it is covered so as not to disturb or confuse the mourners. Those who prefer can interpret it in a psychological sense, demons as guilt and self-reproach that should not be looked at on those days. History and custom. Studies indicate that it does not appear in the Rishonim. It appears in 19th century sources, such as the Chatam Sofer, and became universal due to its symbolic function. Other explanations link it to ancient practices of turning beds to discourage marital relations, prohibited during Shiva, and this means covering mirrors based on the sane logic of modesty. In short, covering mirrors supports the atmosphere of Shiva, not a Talmudic law. It combines modesty, concentration on the loss, sensitivity to the presence of the soul according to the Zohar, and prevention of distractions during prayers. That's it for today's class. See you in the next video.